Chapter 5. A Woman's Scream. Saturday, April 2nd, 2:30 p.m. Vance, after glancing at the strange message with its even stranger signature, reached for his monocle with that slow deliberation which I knew indicated a keen, suppressed interest. Having adjusted the glass, he studied the paper intently. Then he handed it to Arneson. "Here's a valuable factor for your equation." His eyes were fixed banteringly on the man. Arneson regarded the note superciliously, and with a wry grimace laid it on the table. "I trust the clergy are not involved in this problem. They're notoriously unscientific. One can't attack them with mathematics." The bishop. He mused. "I'm unacquainted with any gentleman of the cloth. I think I'll rule out this abracadabra when making my calculations." "If you do, Mr. Arneson," replied Vance seriously, "your equation, I fear, will fall to pieces. That cryptic epistle strikes me as rather significant. Indeed, if you will pardon a mere lay opinion, I believe it is the most mathematical thing that has appeared thus far in the case. It relieves the situation of all haphazardness or accident. It's the G, so to speak, the gravitational constant which will govern all our equations." Heath had stood looking down on the typewritten paper with solemn disgust. "Some crank wrote this, Mr. Vance," he declared. "Undoubtedly a crank, Sergeant," agreed Vance. "But don't overlook the fact that this particular crank must have known many interesting and intimate details, to wit that Mr. Robin's middle name was Cochrane, that the gentleman had been killed with a bow and arrow, and that Mr. Spurling was in the vicinity at the time of the Robin's passing. Moreover, this well-informed crank must have had what amounted to foreknowledge regarding the murder, for the note was obviously typed and inserted in the letterbox before you and your men arrived on the scene. Unless, countered Heath doggedly, he's one of those bimbos out in the street who got wise to what had happened and then stuck this paper in the box when the officer's back was turned, having first run home and carefully typewritten his communication. Eh, what? Vance shook his head with a rueful smile. "No, Sergeant. I'm afraid your theory won't do." "Then what in hell does it mean?" Heath demanded truculently. "I haven't the foggiest idea." Vance yawned and rose. "Come, Markham, let's while away a few brief moments with this Mr. Drucker whom Beadle abhors." "Drucker!" exclaimed Arneson with considerable surprise. "Where does he fit in?" "Mr. Drucker," explained Markham, "called here this morning to see you, and it's barely possible he met Robin and Spurling before he returned home." He hesitated. "Would you care to accompany us?" "No, thanks." Arneson knocked out his pipe and got up. "I've a pile of class papers to look over. It might be as well, however, to take Belle along. Lady May's a bit peculiar." "Lady May?" "My mistake. Forgot you didn't know her. We all call her Lady May. Courtesy title. Pleases the poor old soul. I'm referring to Drucker's mother. Odd character." He tapped his forehead significantly. "Bit touched. Oh, perfectly harmless, bright as a whistle, but monominded, as it were. Thinks the sun rises and sets in Drucker. Mothers him as if he were an infant. Sad situation." "Yes, you'd better take Belle along. Lady May likes Belle." "A good suggestion, Mr. Arneson," said Vance. "Will you ask Miss Dillard if she'll be good enough to accompany us?" "Oh, certainly." Arneson gave us an inclusive smile of farewell, a smile which seemed at once patronizing and satirical, and went upstairs. A few moments later, Miss Dillard joined us. "Sigurd tells me you want to see Adolphe." "He, of course, won't mind, but poor Lady May gets so upset over even the littlest things." "We shan't upset her, I hope." Vance spoke reassuringly. "But Mr. Drucker was here this morning, do you see? And the cook says she thought she heard him speaking to Mr. Robin and Mr. Spurling in the archery room. He may be able to help us." "I'm sure he will if he can," the girl answered with emphasis. "But be very careful with Lady May, won't you?" There was a pleading, protective note in her voice, and Vance regarded her curiously. "Tell us something of Mrs. Drucker, or Lady May, before we visit her. Why should we be so careful?" "She's had such a tragic life," the girl explained. "She was once a great singer. Oh, not just a second-rate artist, but a prima donna with a marvelous career before her. 10. She married a leading critic of Vienna, Otto Drucker, 11, and 4 years later Adolf was born. Then one day in the Wiener Prater, when the baby was 2 years old, she let him fall, and from that moment on, her entire life was changed. Adolf's spine was injured, and he became a cripple. Lady May was heartbroken. She held herself to blame for his injury and gave up her career to devote herself to his care. When her husband died a year later, she brought Adolf to America, where she had spent some of her girlhood, and bought the house where she now lives. Her whole life has been centered on Adolf, who grew up a hunchback. She has sacrificed everything for him and cares for him as though he were a baby. A shadow crossed her face. Sometimes I think, we all think, that she still imagines he's only a child. She has become, well, morbid about it. But it's the sweet, terrible morbidity of a tremendous mother love, a sort of insanity of tenderness, Uncle calls it. During the past few months, she has grown very strange and peculiar. I've often found her crooning old German lullabies and kindergarten songs, with her arms crossed on her breast as if, oh, it seems so sacred and so terrible, as if she were holding a baby. And she has become frightfully jealous of Adolf. She's resentful of all other men. Only last week I took Mr. Spurling to see her. We often drop in to call on her. She seemed so lonely and unhappy, and she looked at him almost fiercely and said, "Why weren't you a cripple too?" The girl paused and searched our faces. "Now don't you understand why I asked you to be careful? Lady May think we have come to harm Adolf. We shan't add unnecessarily to her suffering," Vance assured her sympathetically. Then, as we moved toward the hall, he asked her a question which recalled to my mind his brief, intense scrutiny of the Drucker house earlier that afternoon. "Where is Mrs. Drucker's room situated?" The girl shot him a startled look, but answered promptly, "On the west side of the house. Its bay window overlooks the archery range." "Ah." Vance took out his cigarette case and carefully selected a régie. "Does she sit much at this window?" "A great deal. Lady May always watches us at archery practice. Why, I don't know. I'm sure it pains her to see us, for Adolf isn't strong enough to shoot. He's tried it several times, but it tired him, so he had to give it up. She may watch you practicing for the very reason that it does torture her. A kind of self-immolation, you know. Those situations are very distressing." Vance spoke almost with tenderness, which, to one who did not know his real nature, would have sounded strange. "Perhaps," he added as we emerged into the archery range through the basement door, "it would be best if we saw Mrs. Drucker first for a moment. It might tend to allay any apprehensions our visit might cause her. Could we reach her room without Mr. Drucker's knowledge?" "Oh, yes." The girl was pleased at the idea. "We can go in the rear way. Adolf's study, where he does his writing, is at the front of the house." We found Mrs. Drucker sitting in the great bay window on a sprawling old-fashioned chaise longue propped up with pillows. Miss Dillard greeted her filially and, bending over her with tender concern, kissed her forehead. "Something rather awful has happened at our house this morning, Lady May," she said, "and these gentlemen wanted to see you. I offered to bring them over. You don't mind, do you?" Mrs. Drucker's pale, tragic face had been turned away from the door as we entered, but now she stared at us with fixed horror. She was a tall woman, slender to the point of emaciation, and her hands, which lay slightly flexed on the arms of the chair, were sinewy and wrinkled like the talons of fabulous bird-women. Her face, too, was thin and deeply seamed, but it was not an unattractive face. The eyes were clear and alive, and the nose was straight and dominant. Though she must have been well past 60, her hair was luxuriant and brown. For several minutes she neither moved nor spoke. Then her hands closed slowly, and her lips parted. "What do you want?" she asked in a low, resonant voice. "Mrs. Drucker," it was Vance who answered, "as Miss Dillard has told you, a tragedy occurred next door this morning, and since your window is the only one directly overlooking the archery range, we thought that you might have seen something that would aid us in our investigation." The woman's vigilance relaxed perceptibly. But it was a moment or two before she spoke. And what did take place? A Mr. Robin was killed. You knew him, perhaps? The archer. Belle's champion archer. Yes, I knew him. A strong, healthy child who could pull a heavy bow and not get tired. Who killed him? We don't know. Vance, despite his negligent air, was watching her astutely. But inasmuch as he was killed on the range within sight of your window, we hoped you might be able to help us. Mrs. Drucker's eyelids drooped craftily, and she clasped her hands with a kind of deliberate satisfaction. You are sure he was killed on the range? We found him on the range, Vance returned non-committally. I see. But what can I do to help you? She lay back relaxed. Did you notice anyone on the range this morning? Asked Vance. No. The denial was swift and emphatic. I saw no one. I haven't looked out on the range all day. Vance met the woman's gaze steadily and sighed. It's most unfortunate, he murmured. Had you been looking out of the window this morning, it's wholly possible you might have seen the tragedy. Mr. Robin was killed with a bow and arrow, and there seems to have been no motive whatever for the act. You know he was killed with a bow and arrow? She asked, a tinge of color coming into her ashen cheeks. That was the medical examiner's report. There was an arrow through his heart when we found him. Of course! That seems perfectly natural, doesn't it? An arrow through the Robin's heart. She spoke with vague aloofness, a distant, fascinated look in her eyes. There was a strained silence, and Vance moved toward the window. Do you mind if I look out? With difficulty, the woman brought herself back from some far train of thought. Oh, no. It isn't much of a view, though. I can see the trees of 76th Street toward the north and a part of the Dillard yard to the south. But that brick wall opposite is very depressing. Before the apartment house was built, I had a beautiful view of the river. Vance looked for a while down into the archery range. Yes, he observed. If only you had been at the window this morning, you might have seen what happened. Your view of the range and the basement door of the Dillards is very clear. Too bad. He glanced at his watch. Is your son in, Mrs. Drucker? My son, my baby. What do you want with him? Her voice rose pitifully, and her eyes fastened on Vance with venomous hatred. Nothing important, he said, pacifying. Only, he may have seen someone on the range. He saw no one. He couldn't have seen anyone, for he wasn't here. He went out early this morning and hasn't returned. Vance looked with pity at the woman. He was away all morning. Do you know where he was? I always know where he is, Mrs. Drucker answered proudly. He tells me everything. And he told you where he was going this morning? Persisted Vance gently. Certainly. But I forget for the moment. Let me think. Her long fingers tapped on the arm of the chair, and her eyes shifted uneasily. I can't recall. But I'll ask him the moment he returns. Miss Dillard had stood watching the woman with growing perplexity. But Lady May, Adolf was at our house this morning. He came to see Sigurd. Mrs. Drucker drew herself up. Nothing of the kind, she snapped, eyeing the girl almost viciously. Adolf had to go. Downtown somewhere. He wasn't near your house. I know he wasn't. Her eyes flashed, and she turned a defiant glare on Vance. It was an embarrassing moment, but what followed was even more painful. The door opened softly, and suddenly Mrs. Drucker's arms went out. My little boy, my baby, she cried. Come here, dear. But the man at the door did not come forward. He stood blinking his beady little eyes at us, like a person waking in strange surroundings. Adolf Drucker was scarcely 5 feet tall. He had the typical congested appearance of the hunchback. His legs were spindling, and the size of his bulging, distorted torso seemed exaggerated by his huge, dome-like head. But there was intellectuality in the man's face, a terrific, passionate power which held one's attention. Professor Dillard had called him a mathematical genius, and one could have no doubts as to his erudition. 12. What does all this mean? he demanded in a high-pitched, tremulous voice, looking toward Miss Dillard. "Are these friends of yours, Belle?" The girl started to speak, but Vance halted her with a gesture. "The truth is, Mr. Drucker," he explained somberly, "there has been a tragedy next door. This is Mr. Markham, the district attorney, and Sergeant Heath of the police department. And at our request, Miss Dillard brought us here that we might ask your mother whether or not she had noticed anything unusual on the archery range this morning. The tragedy occurred just outside the basement door of the Dillard house." Drucker thrust his chin forward and squinted. "A tragedy, eh? What kind of tragedy?" Mr. Robin was killed with a bow and arrow." The man's face began to twitch spasmodically. "Robin killed? Killed? What time?" "Sometime between 11 and 12, probably." "Between 11 and 12? Quickly, Drucker's gaze shifted to his mother. He seemed to grow excited, and his huge splay fingers worried the hem of his smoking jacket. "What did you see?" His eyes glinted as he focused them on the woman. "What do you mean, son?" The retort was a panic-stricken whisper. Drucker's face became hard, and the suggestion of a sneer twisted his lips. "I mean that it was about that time when I heard a scream in this room." "You didn't!" "No, no." She caught her breath and wagged her head jerkily. "You're mistaken, son. I didn't scream this morning." "Well, someone did." There was a cold relentlessness in the man's tone. Then, after a pause, he added, "The fact is, I came upstairs after I heard the scream and listened at the door here. But you were walking about humming Iapopeia, so I went back to my work." Mrs. Drucker pressed a handkerchief to her face, and her eyes closed momentarily. "You were at your work between 11 and 12? Her voice now rang with subdued eagerness. "But I called you several times. I heard you, but I didn't answer. I was too busy." "So that was it." She turned slowly toward the window. "I thought you were out." "Didn't you tell me?" "I told you I was going to the Dillards." "But Sigurd wasn't there, and I came back a little before 11. I didn't see you come in." The woman's energy was spent, and she lay back listlessly, her eyes on the brick wall opposite. "And when I called and you didn't answer, I naturally thought you were still out. I left the Dillards by the street gate and took a walk in the park." Drucker's voice was irritable. "Then I let myself in by the front door. And you say you heard me scream. But why should I scream, son? I've had no pains in my back this morning." Drucker frowned, and his little eyes moved swiftly from Vance to Markham. "I heard someone scream. A woman in this room," he iterated stubbornly. "About 11:30. Then he sank into a chair and gazed moodily at the floor. This perplexing verbal intercourse between mother and son had held us all spellbound. Though Vance had stood before an old 18th-century print near the door, regarding it with apparent absorption, I knew that no word or inflection had escaped him. Now he swung about and, giving Markham a signal not to interfere, approached Mrs. Drucker. "We're very sorry, madam, that we've had to trouble you. Forgive us, if you can." He bowed and turned to Miss Dillard. "Do you care to pilot us back? Or shall we find our own way down?" "I'll come with you," the girl said, and going to Mrs. Drucker, she put her arm about her. "I'm so sorry, Lady May." As we were passing out into the hall, Vance, as if on second thought, paused and looked back at Drucker. "You'd better come with us, sir," he said in a casual yet urgent tone. "You knew Mr. Robin, and you may be able to suggest something." "Don't go with them, son!" cried Mrs. Drucker. She was sitting upright now, her face contorted with anguish and fear. "Don't go! They're the enemy! They want to hurt you!" Drucker had risen. "Why shouldn't I go with them?" he retorted petulantly. "I want to find out about this affair. Maybe, as they say, I can help them." And with a gesture of impatience, he joined us. Chapter 6. "I," said the Sparrow. Saturday, April 2nd, 3 p.m. When we were again in the Dillard drawing-room and Miss Dillard had left us to rejoin her uncle in the library, Vance, without preliminaries, proceeded to the business in hand. I didn't care to worry your mother, Mr. Drucker, by questioning you in front of her, but inasmuch as you called here this morning shortly before Mr. Robin's death, it is necessary, as a mere routine procedure, that we seek whatever information you can give us. Drucker had seated himself near the fireplace. He now drew in his head cautiously, but made no answer. You came here, continued Vance, about 9:30, I believe, to call on Mr. Arneson. Yes, by way of the archery range and the basement door. I always come that way. Why walk around the block? But Mr. Arneson was out this morning. Drucker nodded. At the university. And, finding Mr. Arneson away, you sat for a while in the library with Professor Dillard, I understand, discussing an astronomical expedition to South America. The expedition of the Royal Astronomical Society to Sobral to test the Einsteinian deflection, amplified Drucker. How long were you in the library? Less than half an hour. And then? I went down to the archery room and glanced at one of the magazines. There was a chess problem in it, a zugzwang endgame that came up recently between Shapiro and Marshall, and I sat down and worked it out. Just a moment, Mr. Drucker. A note of suppressed interest came into Vance's voice. You're interested in chess? To a certain extent. I don't spend much time at it, however. The game is not purely mathematical, and it's insufficiently speculative to appeal to a wholly scientific mind. Did you find the Shapiro-Marshall position difficult? Not so difficult as tricky. Drucker was watching Vance shrewdly. As soon as I discovered that an apparently useless pawn move was the key to the impasse, the solution was simple. How long did it take you? Half an hour or so. Until about 10:30, shall we say? That would be about right. Drucker settled deeper into his chair, but his covert alertness did not relax. Then you must have been in the archery room when Mr. Robin and Mr. Sperling came there. The man did not answer at once, and Vance, pretending not to notice his hesitancy, added, Professor Dillard said they called at the house about 10, and after waiting a while in the drawing room here, went down to the basement. Where's Sperling now, by the way? Drucker's eyes darted suspiciously from one to the other of us. We expect him here any minute, Vance replied. Sergeant Heath has sent 2 of his men to fetch him. The hunchback's eyebrows lifted. So Sperling is being forcibly brought back. He pyramided his spatulate fingers and inspected them musingly. Then he slowly lifted his eyes to Vance. You asked me if I saw Robin and Sperling in the archery room. Yes, they came downstairs just as I was going. Vance leaned back and stretched his legs before him. Did you get the impression, Mr. Drucker, that they had, as we euphemistically say, been having words? The man considered this question for several moments. Now that you mention it, he said at length, I do recall that there seemed to be a coolness between them. I wouldn't, however, care to be too categorical on that point. You see, I left the room almost immediately after they entered. You went out the basement door, I think you said, and thence through the wall gate into 75th Street. Is that correct? For a moment, Drucker seemed loath to answer, but he replied with an effort at unconcern. Quite. I thought I'd take a stroll along the river before going back to work. I went to the drive, then up the bridle path, and turned into the park at 79th Street. Heath, with his habitual suspicion of all statements made to the police, put the next question. Did you meet anyone you knew? Drucker turned angrily, but Vance quickly stepped into the breach. It really doesn't matter, Sergeant. If it's necessary later on to ascertain that point, we can take the matter up again. Then to Drucker. You returned from your walk a little before 11, I think you said, and entered your house by the front door. That's right. You saw nothing, by the by, that was in the least extraordinary when you were here this morning? I saw nothing except what I've told you. And you're quite sure you heard your mother scream at about 11:30? Vance did not move as he asked this question, but a slightly different note had crept into his voice, and it acted on Drucker in a startling manner. He heaved his squat body out of his chair and stood glaring down on Vance with menacing fury. His tiny round eyes flashed, and his lips worked convulsively. his hands, dangling before him, flexed and unflexed like those of a man in a paroxysm. "What are you driving at?" he demanded, his voice a shrill falsetto. "I tell you I heard her scream." "I don't care a damn whether she admits it or not. Moreover, I heard her walking in her room. She was in her room, understand, and I was in my room between 11 and 12, and you can't prove anything different. Furthermore, I'm not going to be cross-examined by you or anyone else as to what I was doing or where I was. It's none of your damn business. Do you hear me?" So insensate was his wrath that I expected any minute to see him hurl himself on Vance. Heath had risen and stepped forward, sensing the potential danger of the man. Vance, however, did not move. He continued to smoke languidly, and when the other's fury had been spent, he said quietly and without a trace of emotion, "There's nothing more we have to ask you, Mr. Drucker. And really, there's no need to work yourself up. It merely occurred to me that your mother's scream might help to establish the exact time of the murder." "What could her scream have to do with the time of Robin's death? Didn't she tell you she saw nothing?" Drucker appeared exhausted and leaned heavily against the table. At this moment, Professor Dillard appeared in the archway. Behind him stood Arneson. "What seems to be the matter?" the professor asked. "I heard the noise here and came down." He regarded Drucker coldly. "Hasn't Belle been through enough today without your frightening her this way?" Vance had risen, but before he could speak, Arneson came forward and shook his finger in mock reprimand at Drucker. "You really should learn control, Adolf. You take life with such abominable seriousness. You've worked in interstellar spatial magnitudes long enough to have some sense of proportion. Why attach so much importance to this pinpoint of life on Earth?" Drucker was breathing stertorously. "These swine—" he began. "Oh, my dear Adolf!" Arneson cut him short. "The entire human race are swine. Why particularize? Come along, I'll see you home." And he took Drucker's arm firmly and led him downstairs. "We're very sorry we disturbed you, sir," Markham apologized to Professor Dillard. "The man flew off the handle for some unknown reason. These investigations are not the pleasantest things in the world, but we hope to be through before long." "Well, make it as brief as you can, Markham. And do try to spare Belle as much as possible. Let me see you before you go." When Professor Dillard had returned upstairs, Markham took a turn up and down the room, his brows knit, his hands clasped behind him. "What do you make of Drucker?" he asked, halting before Vance. Decidedly not a pleasant character. Diseased physically and mentally, a congenital liar, but canny, oh, deuced canny. An abnormal brain. You often find it in cripples of his type. Sometimes it runs to real constructive genius, as with Steinmetz, but too often it takes to abstruse speculation along impractical lines, as with Drucker. Still, our little verbal give and take has not been without fruit. He's hiding something that he'd like to tell, but doesn't dare. "That's possible, of course," returned Markham doubtfully. "He's touchy on the subject of that hour between 11 and noon, and he was watching you all the time like a cat." "A weasel," Vance corrected him. "Yes, I was aware of his flattering scrutiny. Anyway, I can't see that he's helped us very much." "No," agreed Vance. "We're not exactly forrader, but we're at least getting some luggage aboard. Our excitable mathematical wizard has opened up some very interesting lines of speculation, and Mrs. Drucker is fairly teeming with possibilities. If we knew what both of them together know, we might find the key to this silly business." Heath had been sullen for the past hour, and had looked on at the proceedings with bored disdain. But now he drew himself up combatively. "I'm here to tell you, Mr. Markham, that we're wasting our time. What's the good of all these parleys? Sperling's the boy we want, and when my men bring him in and put him through a little sweating, we'll have enough material for an indictment. He was in love with the Dillard girl and was jealous of Robin, not only on account of the girl, but because Robin could shoot those red sticks straighter than he could. He had a scrap with Robin in this here room. The professor heard him at it, and he was downstairs with Robin, according to the evidence, a few minutes before the murder. And," added Vance ironically, "his name means sparrow. quaderat demonstrandum. No, Sergeant, it's much too easy. It works out like a game of Canfield with the cards stacked, whereas this thing was planned much too carefully for suspicion to fall directly on the guilty person. I can't see any careful planning about it, persisted Heath. This Sperling gets sore, picks up a bow, grabs an arrow off of the wall, follows Robin outside, shoots him through the heart, and beats it. Vance sighed. You're far too forthright for this wicked world, Sergeant. If only things happened with such naive dispatch, life would be very simple and depressing. But such was not the modus operandi of the Robins murder. First, no archer could shoot at a moving human target and strike just between the ribs over the vital spot of the heart. Secondly, there's that fracture of Robin's skull. He may have acquired it in falling, but it's not likely. Thirdly, his hat was at his feet, where it wouldn't have been if he had fallen naturally. Fourthly, the knock on the arrow is so bruised that I doubt if it would hold a string. Fifthly, Robin was facing the arrow, and during the drawing and aiming of the bow, he would have had time to call out and cover himself. Sixthly, Vance paused in the act of lighting a cigarette. By Jove, Sergeant! I've overlooked something. When a man's stabbed in the heart, there's sure to be an immediate flow of blood, especially when the end of the weapon is larger than the shaft, and there's no adequate plug for the hole. I say, it's quite possible that you'll find some blood spots on the floor of the archery room, somewhere near the door, most likely. Heath hesitated, but only momentarily. Experience had long since taught him that Vance's suggestions were not to be treated cavalierly, and with a good-natured grunt, he got up and disappeared toward the rear of the house. I think, Vance, I begin to see what you mean, observed Markham with a troubled look. But good God! If Robin's apparent death with a bow and arrow was merely an ex post facto stage setting, then we're confronted by something almost too diabolical to contemplate. It was the work of a maniac, declared Vance with unwanted sobriety. Oh, not the conventional maniac who imagines he's Napoleon, but a madman with a brain so colossal that he has carried sanity to a, humanly speaking, reductio ad absurdum. To a point, that is, where humor itself becomes a formula in 4 dimensions. Markham smoked vigorously, lost in speculation. I hope Heath doesn't find anything, he said at length. Why, in heaven's name? Returned Vance. If there's no material evidence that Robin met his end in the archery room, it'll only make the problem more difficult legally. But the material evidence was forthcoming. The sergeant returned a few minutes later, crestfallen but excited. Damn it, Mr. Vance, he blurted. You had the dope all right. He made no attempt to keep the admiration out of his look. There isn't any actual blood on the floor, but there's a dark place on the cement where somebody scrubbed it with a wet rag today sometime. It ain't dry yet, and the place is right near the door, where you said. And what makes it more suspicious is that one of those rugs has been pulled over it. But that don't let Sperling out altogether, he added pugnaciously. He might have shot Robin indoors. And then cleaned up the blood, wiped off the bow and arrow, and placed the body and the bow on the range before making his departure. Why? Archery, to begin with, isn't an indoor sport, Sergeant, and Sperling knows too much about it to attempt murder with a bow and arrow. A hit such as the one that ended Robin's uneventful career would have been a pure fluke. Teucer himself couldn't have achieved it with any degree of certainty. And according to Homer, Teucer was the champion archer of the Greeks. As he spoke, Pardee passed down the hall on his way out. He had nearly reached the front door when Vance rose suddenly and went to the archway. Oh, I say, Mr. Pardee, just a moment, please. The man turned with an air of gracious compliance. There is one other question we'd like to ask you, said Vance. You mentioned seeing Mr. Sperling and Beadle leave here this morning by the wall gate. Are you sure you saw no one else use the gate? Quite sure. That is, I don't recall anyone else. I was thinking particularly of Mr. Drucker. Oh, Drucker. Pardee shook his head with mild emphasis. No, I would have remembered him. But you realize a dozen people might have entered and left this house without my noticing them. Quite, Vance murmured indifferently. How good a chess player, by the by, is Mr. Drucker? Pardee showed a flicker of surprise. He's not a player in the practical sense at all, he explained with careful precision. He's an excellent analyst, however, and understands the theory of the game amazingly well. But he's had little practice at actual over-the-board play. When Pardee had gone, Heath cocked a triumphant eye at Vance. "I notice, sir," he remarked good-naturedly, "that I'm not the only one who'd like to check the hunchback's alibi." "Ah, but there's a difference between checking an alibi and demanding that the person himself prove it." At this moment, the front door was thrown open. There were heavy footsteps in the hall, and 3 men appeared in the archway. 2 were obviously detectives, and between them stood a tall, clean-cut youth of about 30. "We got him, Sergeant," announced one of the detectives, with a grin of vicious satisfaction. "He beat it straight home from here and was packing up when we walked in on him." Sperling's eyes swept the room with angry apprehension. Heath had planted himself before the man and stood looking him up and down triumphantly. "Well, young fella, you thought you'd get away, did you?" The sergeant's cigar bobbed up and down between his lips as he spoke. The color mounted to Sperling's cheeks, and he set his mouth stubbornly. "So, you've got nothing to say?" Heath went on, squaring his jaw ferociously. "You're one of these silent lads, are you? Well, we'll make you talk." He turned to Markham. "How about it, sir? Shall I take him to headquarters?" "Perhaps Mr. Sperling will not object to answering a few questions here," said Markham quietly. Sperling studied the district attorney a moment, then his gaze moved to Vance, who nodded to him encouragingly. "Answer questions about what?" he asked, with an obvious effort at self-control. "I was preparing to go away for the weekend when these ruffians forced their way into my room, and I was brought here without a word of explanation or even an opportunity to communicate with my family. Now you talk of taking me to police headquarters." He gave Heath a defiant glare. "All right, take me to police headquarters and be damned to you." "What time did you leave here this morning, Mr. Sperling?" Vance's tone was soft and ingratiating, and his manner reassuring. "About 11:15, the man answered, "in time to catch the 11:40 Scarsdale train from Grand Central." "And Mr. Robin?" "I don't know what time Robin went. He said he was going to wait for Belle, Miss Dillard. I left him in the archery room." "You saw Mr. Drucker?" "For a minute, yes. He was in the archery room when Robin and I went downstairs, but he left immediately." "Through the wall gate? Or did he walk down the range?" "I don't remember. In fact, I didn't notice." "Say, look here. What's all this about, anyway?" "Mr. Robin was killed this morning," said Vance, "at some time near 11 o'clock. Sperling's eyes seemed to start from his head. "Robin killed? My God, who killed him?" The man's lips were dry and he wetted them with his tongue. "We don't know yet," Vance answered. "He was shot through the heart with an arrow." This news left Sperling stunned. His eyes traveled vaguely from side to side, and he fumbled in his pocket for a cigarette. Heath stepped nearer to him and thrust out his chin. "Maybe you can tell us who killed him, with a bow and arrow." Why do you think I know?" Sperling managed to stammer. "Well," returned the sergeant relentlessly, "you were jealous of Robin, weren't you? You had a hot argument with him about the girl right in this room, didn't you? And you were alone with him just before he was croaked, weren't you? And you're a pretty good shot with the bow and arrow, aren't you? That's why I think that maybe you know something." He narrowed his eyes and drew his upper lip over his teeth. "Say, come clean. Nobody else but you could have done it? You had a fight with him over the girl, and you were the last person seen with him, only a few minutes before he was killed. And who else would have shot him with a bow and arrow except a champagne archer, huh? Make it easy for yourself and spill the story. We've got you." A strange light had gathered in Sperling's eyes, and his body became rigid. "Tell me," he spoke in a strained, unnatural voice. "Did you find the bow?" "Sure we found it." Heath laughed unpleasantly. "Right where you left it, in the alley." "What kind of a bow was it?" Sperling's gaze had not moved from some distant point. "What kind of a bow?" repeated Heath. "A regular bow." Vance, who had been watching the youth closely, interrupted. "I think I understand the question, Sergeant. It was a woman's bow, Mr. Spurling. About 5 feet 6 and rather light. Under 30 pounds, I should say. Spurling drew a slow, deep breath, like a man steeling himself for some bitter resolution. Then his lips parted in a faint, grim smile. "What's the use?" he asked listlessly. "I thought I'd have time to get away." "Yes, I killed him." Heath grunted with satisfaction, and his belligerent manner at once disappeared. "You got more sense than I thought you had," he said, in an almost paternal tone, nodding in a businesslike manner to the two detectives. "Take him along, boys. Use my buggy. It's outside. And lock him up without booking him. I'll prefer the charge when I get to the office." "Come along, Bo," ordered one of the detectives, turning toward the hall. But Spurling did not at once obey. Instead, he looked appealingly at Vance. Might I, he began. Vance shook his head. "No, Mr. Spurling. It would be best if you didn't see Miss Dillard. No use of harrowing her feelings just now. Cheerio." The man turned without another word and went out between his captors. Chapter 7. Vance reaches a conclusion. Saturday, April 2nd, 3:30 p.m. When we were again alone in the drawing room, Vance rose and, stretching himself, went to the window. The scene that had just been enacted, with its startling climax, had left us all somewhat dazed. Our minds were busy, I think, with the same idea, and when Vance spoke, it was as if he were voicing our thoughts. "We're back in the nursery, it seems." "Aye," said the sparrow. "With my bow and arrow, I killed Cock Robin. I say, Markham, this is getting a bit thick." He came slowly back to the centre table and crushed out his cigarette. From the corner of his eye, he looked at Heath. "Why so pensive, Sergeant? You should be singing roundelays and doing a joyous tarantella. Has not your villain confessed to the dark deed? Does it not fill you with gladness to know that the culprit will soon be languishing in an oubliette?" "To tell you the truth, Mr. Vance," Heath admitted sullenly, "I'm not satisfied. That confession came too easy, and, well, I've seen a lot of guys come across, but this one somehow didn't act like he was guilty. And that's a fact, sir." "At any rate," submitted Markham hopefully, "his preposterous confession will damp the newspaper's curiosity and give us a free field to push our investigation. This case is going to make an ungodly noise, but as long as the reporters think the guilty person is jailed, they won't be bothering us for news of developments." "Ha! I'm not saying he ain't guilty," asserted Heath pugnaciously, obviously arguing against his own convictions. "We certainly had the goods on him, and he might have realized it and spilled the works, thinking it would go easier with him at the trial. Maybe he's not so dumb after all." "It won't do, Sergeant," said Vance. "The lad's mental workings were deucedly simple. He knew Robin was waiting to see Miss Dillard, and he also knew she'd non-suited him, so to speak, last night. Spurling evidently didn't have a high opinion of Robin, and when he heard of the gentleman's death at the hands of someone who wielded a short, light bow, he jumped to the conclusion that Robin had overstepped the bounds of propriety in his wooing and received a righteous shaft through the heart. There was then nothing for our noble mid-Victorian sparrow to do but slap his own manly bosom and proclaim, "Ecce homo." It's most distressing. "Well, anyhow," grumbled Heath, "I'm not going to turn him loose. If Mr. Markham don't want to prosecute, that's up to him." Markham looked at the sergeant tolerantly. He realized the strain the man was under, and it was in keeping with his bigness of nature that he took no offense at the other's words. "Perhaps, however, Sergeant," he said kindly, "you'll not object to continuing the investigation with me, even if I don't decide to prosecute Spurling." Heath was at once contrite. He got up briskly and, going to Markham, held out his hand. "You know it, sir?" Markham took the offered hand and rose with a gracious smile. "I'll leave things with you then for the time being. I've some work to do at the office, and I told Swacker to wait for me." 13. He moved dispiritedly toward the hall. I'll explain the situation to Miss Dillard and the professor before I go. Anything special in mind, Sergeant? Well, sir, I think I'll take a good look for that rag that was used to wipe up the floor downstairs. And while I'm at it, I'll go over the archery room with a fine-tooth comb. Also, I'll put the screws to the cook and the butler again, especially the cook. She must have been mighty close at hand when the dirty work was going on. Then the regular routine stuff, inquiries in the neighborhood and that sort of thing. Let me know the results. I'll be at the Stuyvesant Club later today and tomorrow afternoon. Vance had joined Markham in the archway. I say, old man, he remarked as we went toward the stairs, don't minimize the importance of that cryptic note left in the mailbox. I've a strong psychic suspicion that it may be the key to the nursery. You'd better ask Professor Dillard and his niece if Bishop has any provocative significance for them. That diocesan signature has a meaning. I'm not so sure, returned Markham dubiously. It appears utterly meaningless to me, but I'll follow your suggestion. Neither the professor nor Miss Dillard, however, could recall any personal association with the word bishop, and the professor was inclined to agree with Markham that the note was without any significant bearing on the case. It strikes me, he said, as a piece of juvenile melodrama. It isn't likely that the person who killed Robin would adopt a vague pseudonym and write notes about his crime. I'm not acquainted with criminals, but such conduct doesn't impress me as logical. But the crime itself was illogical, ventured Vance pleasantly. One can't speak of a thing being illogical, sir, returned the professor tartly, when one is ignorant of the very premises of a syllogism. Exactly. Vance's tone was studiously courteous. Therefore, the note itself may not be without logic. Markham tactfully changed the subject. What I came particularly to tell you, Professor, is that Mr. Spurling called a short time ago, and when informed of Mr. Robin's death, confessed to having done it himself. Raymond confessed, gasped Miss Dillard. Markham looked at the girl sympathetically. To be quite frank, I didn't believe Mr. Spurling. Some mistaken idea of chivalry undoubtedly led him to admit the crime. Chivalry, she repeated, leaning forward tensely. What exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Markham? It was Vance who answered. The bow that was found on the range was a woman's bow. Oh! The girl covered her face with her hands and her body shook with sobs. Professor Dillard regarded her helplessly, and his impotency took the form of irritation. What flummery is this, Markham? He demanded. Any archer can shoot with a woman's bow. That unutterable young idiot. Why should he make Belle miserable by his preposterous confession? Markham, my friend, do what you can for the boy. Markham gave his assurances, and we rose to go. By the by, Professor Dillard, said Vance, pausing at the door. I trust you won't misunderstand me, but there's a bare possibility that it was someone with access to this house who indulged in the practical joke of typing that note. Is there by any chance a typewriter on the premises? It was patent that the professor resented Vance's question, but he answered civilly enough. No, nor has there ever been one to my knowledge. I threw my own machine away 10 years ago when I left the university. An agency does whatever typing I need. And Mr. Arneson? He never uses a typewriter. As we descended the stairs, we met Arneson returning from Drucker's. I've placated our local Leibniz, he announced with an exaggerated sigh. Poor old Adolf. The world is too much with him. When he's wallowing in the relativist formulas of Lorentz and Einstein, he's serene. But when he's dragged down to actuality, he disintegrates. It may interest you to know, said Vance casually, that Spurling has just confessed to the murder. Ha ha! Arneson chuckled. Quite in keeping. Aye, said the Sparrow. Very neat. Still, I don't know how it'll work out mathematically. And since we agreed to keep you posted, continued Vance, it may help your calculations to know that we have reason to believe that Robin was killed in the archery room and placed on the range afterwards. Glad to know it. Arneson became momentarily serious. Yes, that may affect my problem. He walked with us to the front door. If there's any way I can be of service to you, call on me. Vance had paused to light a cigarette, but I knew, by the languid look in his eyes, that he was making a decision. Slowly he turned to Arneson. "Do you know if Mr. Drucker or Mr. Pardee has a typewriter?" Arneson gave a slight start, and his eyes twinkled shrewdly. "Aha! That Bishop note. I see. Merely a matter of being thorough. Quite right." He nodded with satisfaction. "Yes, both have typewriters. Drucker types incessantly, thinks to the keyboard, so he says. And Pardee's chess correspondence is as voluminous as a movie hero's. Types it all himself, too." "Would it be any great trouble to you," asked Vance, "to secure a specimen of the typing of each machine, and also a sample of the paper these two gentlemen use?" "None whatever." Arneson appeared delighted with the commission. "Have them for you this afternoon. Well, you be. Mr. Markham will be at the Stuyvesant Club. You might phone him there and he can arrange—" "Why bother to arrange anything? I'll bring my findings to Mr. Markham personally. Only too glad. Fascinating game, being a sleuth." Vance and I returned home in the district attorney's car, and Markham continued to the office. At 7 o'clock that night, the three of us met at the Stuyvesant Club for dinner, and at 8:30 we were sitting in Markham's favorite corner of the lounge room, smoking and having our coffee. During the meal, no mention of the case had been made. The late editions of the afternoon papers had carried brief accounts of Robin's death. Heath had evidently succeeded in curbing the reporters' curiosity and clipping the wings of their imagination. The district attorney's office being closed, the newspaper men were unable to bombard Markham with questions, and so the late press was inadequately supplied with information. The sergeant had guarded the Dillard house well, for the reporters had not succeeded in reaching any member of the household. Markham had picked up a late Sun on his way from the dining room and glanced through it carefully as he sipped his coffee. "This is the first faint echo," he commented ruefully. "I shudder to think what the morning papers will contain." "There's nothing to do but bear it," smiled Vance unfeelingly. "The moment some bright journalistic lad awakes to the Robin Sparrow-Arrow combination, the city editors will go mad with joy, and every front page in the country will look like a Mother Goose hoarding." Markham lapsed into despondency. Finally, he struck the arm of his chair angrily with his fist. "Damn it, Vance, I won't let you inflame my imagination with this idiocy about nursery rhymes." Then he added with the ferocity of uncertainty, "It's a sheer coincidence, I tell you." "There simply couldn't be anything in it." Vance sighed. "Convince yourself against your will. You're of the same opinion still. To paraphrase Butler." He reached into his pocket and took out a sheet of paper. "Putting old juvenilia to one side pro tempore, here's an edifying chronology I drew up before dinner. Edifying. Well, it might be if we knew how to interpret it." Markham studied the paper for several minutes. What Vance had written down was this: 9 a.m. Arneson left house to go to University Library. 9:15 a.m. Belle Dillard left house for the tennis courts. 9:30 a.m. Drucker called at house to see Arneson. 9:50 a.m. Drucker went downstairs to archery room. 10 a.m. Robin and Sperling called at house and remained in drawing room for half an hour. 10:30 a.m. Robin and Sperling went down to archery room. 10:32 a.m. Drucker says he went out for a walk by the Wall Gate. 10:35 a.m. Beadle went marketing. 10:55 a.m. Drucker says he returned to his own house. 11:15 a.m. Sperling went away by Wallgate. 11:30 a.m. Drucker says he heard a scream in his mother's room. 11:35 a.m. Professor Dillard went on balcony of Arneson's room. 11:40 a.m. Professor Dillard saw Robin's body on archery range. 11:45 a.m. Professor Dillard telephoned to District Attorney's office. 12:25 p.m. Belle Dillard returned from tennis. 12:30 p.m. Police arrived at Dillard House. 12:35 p.m. Beadle returned from market. 2 p.m. Arneson returned from university. Ergo, Robin was killed at some time between 11:15, when Sperling departed, and 11:40, when Professor Dillard discovered body. The only other persons known to have been in the house during this time were Pine and Professor Dillard. The disposition of all other persons connected in any way with the murder was as follows. according to statements and evidence now in hand. 1. Arneson was at the university library between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. 2. Belle Dillard was at the tennis courts between 9:15 a.m. and 12:25 p.m. and 3. Drucker was walking in the park between 10:32 a.m. and 10:55 a.m. and was in his study from 10:55 a.m. on. 4. Pardee was in his house the entire morning. 5. Mrs. Drucker was in her room the entire morning. 6. Beadle was marketing between 10:35 a.m. and 12:35 p.m. 7. Sperling was on his way to the Grand Central Station between 11:15 a.m. and 11:40 a.m., at which hour he took a train for Scarsdale. Conclusion: unless at least one of these 7 alibis is shaken, the whole weight of suspicion, and indeed the actual culpability, must rest upon either Pine or Professor Dillard. When Markham finished reading the paper, he made a gesture of exasperation. "Your entire implication is preposterous," he said irritably, "and your conclusion is a non sequitur. The chronology helps set the time of Robin's death, but your assumption that one of the persons we've seen today is necessarily guilty is arrant nonsense. You completely ignore the possibility that any outsider could have committed the crime. There were 3 ways of reaching the range and the archery room without entering the house: the wall gate on 75th Street, the other wall gate on 76th Street, and the alleyway between the 2 apartment houses leading to Riverside Drive. "Oh, it's highly probable that one of these 3 entrances was used," returned Vance. "But don't overlook the fact that the most secluded, and therefore the most likely, of these 3 means of entry, to wit, the alleyway, is guarded by a locked door to which no one would be apt to have a key except some member of the Dillard household. I can't picture a murderer walking into the range from either of the street gates. He would be taking too many chances of being seen." Vance leaned forward seriously. "And Markham, there are other reasons why we may eliminate strangers or casual prowlers. The person who sent Robin to his maker must have been privy to the exact state of affairs in the Dillard house this morning between 11:15 and 20 minutes to 12. He knew that Pine and the old professor were alone there. He knew that Belle Dillard was not roaming about the premises. He knew that Beadle was away and could neither hear him nor surprise him. He knew that Robin, his victim, was there, and that Sperling had departed. Moreover, he knew something of the lie of the land, the situation of the archery room, for instance, for it's only too plain that Robin was killed in that room. No one who wasn't familiar with all these details would have dared enter the grounds and staged a spectacular murder. I tell you, Markham, it was someone very close to the Dillard menage, someone who was able to find out just what conditions obtained in that household this morning." "What about that scream of Mrs. Drucker's?" "Ah, what about it indeed? Mrs. Drucker's window may have been a factor that the murderer overlooked, or perhaps he knew about it and decided to take that one chance of being seen. On the other hand, we don't know whether the lady screamed or not. She says no, Drucker says yes. They both have an ulterior motive for what they poured into our trusting ears. Drucker may have told of the scream by way of proving he was at home between 11 and 12, and Mrs. Drucker may have denied it for fear he wasn't home. It's very much of an olla podrida, but it doesn't matter. The main point I'm trying to make is that only an intimate of the Dillard house could have done this devilish business." "We have too few facts to warrant that conclusion," asserted Markham. "Chance may have played a part." "Oh, I say, old man. Chance may work out to a few permutations, but not to 20. And there is that note left in the mailbox. The murderer even knew Robin's middle name. Assuming, of course, that the murderer wrote the note. Do you prefer to assume that some balmy joker found out about the crime through telepathy or crystal gazing, hied to a typewriter, composed a dithyramb, returned hot-footed to the house, and for no good reason took the terrific risk of being seen putting the paper in the mailbox?" Before Markham could answer, Heath entered the lounge room and hurried to our corner. That he was worried and uneasy was obvious. With scarcely a word of greeting, he handed a typewritten envelope to Markham. "That was received by the World in the late afternoon mail," Quinan, the police reporter of the World, brought it to me a little while ago, and he says that the Times and the Herald also got copies of it. The letters were stamped at 1 o'clock today, so they were probably posted between 11 and 12. What's more, Mr. Markham, they were mailed in the neighborhood of the Dillard House, for they went through Post Office Station AN on West 69th Street. Markham withdrew the enclosure from the envelope. Suddenly his eyes opened wide and the muscles about his mouth tightened. Without looking up, he handed the letter to Vance. It consisted of a single sheet of typewriting paper, and the words printed on it were identical to those on the note left in the Dillard mailbox. Indeed, the communication was an exact duplicate of the other. Joseph Cochrane Robin is dead. Who killed Cock Robin? Spurling means sparrow. The bishop. Vance scarcely glanced at the paper. Quite in keeping, don't you know? He said indifferently. The bishop was afraid the public might miss the point of his joke, so he explained it to the press. Joke, did you say, Mr. Vance? Asked Heath bitterly. It ain't the kind of joke I'm used to. This case gets crazier. Exactly, Sergeant. A crazy joke. A uniformed boy stepped up to the district attorney and, bending over his shoulder discreetly, whispered something. Bring him here right away, ordered Markham. Then to us. It's Arneson. He'll probably have those specimens of typing a shadow had settled on his face, and he glanced again at the note Heath had brought him. Vance, he said in a low voice, I'm beginning to believe that this case may turn out to be as terrible as you think. I wonder if the typing will correspond. But when the note was compared with the specimens Arneson brought, no similarity whatever could be discerned. Not only were the typing and the ink different from those of either Pardee or Drucker's machine, but the paper did not match any one of the samples that Arneson had secured. Chapter 8, Act 2, Monday, April 11th, 11:30 a.m. There is no need to recall here the nationwide sensation caused by Robin's murder. Everyone remembers how that startling tragedy was featured in the country's press. It was referred to by various designations. Some newspapers called it the Cock-Robin murder. Others, more alliterative but less accurate, 14 termed it the Mother Goose murder. But the signature of the typewritten notes appealed strongly to the journalistic sense of mystery. And in time, the killing of Robin came to be known as the Bishop murder case. Its strange and fearful combination of horror and nursery jargon inflamed the public's imagination, and the sinister and insane implications of its details affected the entire country like some grotesque nightmare whose atmosphere could not be shaken off. During the week following the discovery of Robin's body, the detectives of the Homicide Bureau, as well as the detectives connected with the district attorney's office, were busy night and day pushing their inquiries. The receipt of the duplicate Bishop notes by the leading New York morning papers had dissipated whatever ideas Heath may have held as to Spurling's guilt, and though he refused to put his official imprimatur on the young man's innocence, he threw himself, with his usual gusto and pertinacity, into the task of finding another and more plausible culprit. The investigation which he organized and superintended was as complete as had been that of the Green murder case. No avenue which held the meagerest hope of results was overlooked, and the report he drew up would have given joy even to those meticulous criminologists of the University of Lausanne. On the afternoon of the day of the murder, he and his men had searched for the cloth that had been used to wipe up the blood in the archery room, but no trace of it was found. Also, a thorough examination of the Dillard basement was made in the hope of finding other clues. But although Heath had put the task in the hands of experts, the result was negative. The only point brought to light was that the fiber rug near the door had recently been moved so as to cover the cleansed spot on the cement floor. This fact, however, merely substantiated the sergeant's earlier observation. The post-mortem report of Dr. Doremus lent colour to the now officially accepted theory that Robin had been killed in the archery room and then placed on the range. The autopsy showed that the blow on the back of his skull had been a particularly violent one and had been made with a heavy, rounded instrument, resulting in a depressed fracture quite different from the fissured fracture caused by striking a flat surface. A search was instituted for the weapon with which the blow had been dealt, but no likely instrument was turned up. Though Beadle and Pine were questioned by Heath several times, nothing new was learned from them. Pine insisted that he had been upstairs the entire morning in Arneson's room, except for a few brief absences to the linen closet and the front door, and clung tenaciously to his denial that he had touched either the body or the bow when sent by Professor Dillard to find Spurling. The sergeant, however, was not entirely satisfied with the man's testimony. "That bleary-eyed old cormorant has got something up his sleeve," he told Markham disgustedly. "But it would take the rubber hose and the water cure to make him spill it." A canvass of all the houses in 75th Street between West End Avenue and Riverside Drive was made in the hope of finding a tenant who had noticed someone entering or emerging from the Dillard Wall gate during the forenoon. But nothing was gained by this tedious campaign. Pardee, it seemed, was the only resident within view of the Dillard house who had observed anyone in the neighborhood that morning. In fact, after several days of arduous inquiries along this line, the sergeant realized that he would have to proceed without any outside or fortuitous assistance. The various alibis of the 7 persons whom Vance had tabulated in his notation for Markham were gone into as thoroughly as circumstances would permit. It was obviously impossible to check them completely, for in the main, they were based solely on the statements of the individuals involved. Moreover, the investigation had to be made with the utmost care lest suspicion be aroused. The results of these inquiries were as follows. 1. Arneson had been seen in the university library by various people, including an assistant librarian and 2 students, but the time covered by their evidence was neither consecutive nor specific as to the hour. 2. Belle Dillard had played several sets of tennis at the public courts at 119th Street and Riverside Drive, but because there had been more than 4 in her party, she had twice relinquished her place to a friend, and none of the players could state positively that she had remained at the courts during these periods. 3. The time that Drucker departed from the archery room was definitely determined by Spurling, but no one could be found who had seen him thereafter. He admitted he had met no one he knew in the park, but insisted he had stopped for a few minutes to play with some strange children. 4. Pardee had been alone in his study. His old cook and his Japanese valet had been in the rear of the house and had not seen him until lunchtime. His alibi, therefore, was purely a negative one. 5. Mrs. Drucker's word had to be accepted as to her whereabouts that morning, for no one had seen her between 9:30, when Drucker went to call on Arneson, and 1 o'clock, when the cook brought up her luncheon. 6. Beadle's alibi was checked with fairly satisfactory completeness. Pardee had seen her leave the house at 10:35, and she was remembered by several of the hucksters at the Jefferson Market between 11 and 12. 7. The fact that Spurling had taken the 11:40 train to Scarsdale was verified. Therefore, he would have had to leave the Dillard house at the time he stated, namely 11:15. The determination of this point, however, was merely a matter of routine, for he had been practically eliminated from the case. But if, as Heath explained, it had been found that he had not taken the 11:40 train, he would have again become an important possibility. Pursuing his investigations along more general lines, the sergeant went into the histories and associations of the various persons involved. The task was not a difficult one. All were well known, and information concerning them was readily accessible, but not one item was unearthed that could be regarded as even remotely throwing any light on Robin's murder. Nothing transpired to give so much as a hint to the motive for the crime. And after a week's intensive inquiry and speculation, the case was still cloaked in seemingly impenetrable mystery. Spurling had not been released. The prima facie evidence against him, combined with his absurd confession, made impossible such a step on the part of the authorities. Markham, however, had held an unofficial conference with the attorneys whom Spurling's father had engaged to handle the case, and some sort of a gentleman's agreement had, I imagine, been reached, For although the state made no move to apply for an indictment, despite the fact that the grand jury was sitting at the time, the defense lawyers did not institute habeas corpus proceedings. All the indications pointed to the supposition that both Markham and Sperling's attorneys were waiting for the real culprit to be apprehended. Markham had had several interviews with the members of the Dillard household in a persistent effort to bring out some trivial point that might lead to a fruitful line of inquiry. And Pardee had been summoned to the district attorney's office to make an affidavit as to what he had observed from his window on the morning of the tragedy. Mrs. Drucker had been interrogated again, but not only did she emphatically deny having looked out of her window that morning, but she scoffed at the idea that she had screamed. Drucker, when re-questioned, modified somewhat his former testimony. He explained that he might have been mistaken as to the source of the scream and suggested that it could have come from the street or from one of the court windows of the apartment house. In fact, he said, it was highly unlikely that his mother had uttered the scream, for when he went to her door a moment later, she was humming an old German nursery song from Humperdinck's Hänsel and Gretel. Markham, convinced that nothing further was to be learned from either him or Mrs. Drucker, finally concentrated on the Dillard house itself. Arneson attended the informal conferences held in Markham's office, but for all his voluble and cynical observations, he appeared to be as much at sea as the rest of us. Vance chaffed him good-naturedly about the mathematical formula that was to solve the case, but Arneson insisted that a formula could not be worked out until all the factors of the theorem were available. He appeared to regard the entire affair as a kind of Juvenalian lark, and Markham on several occasions gave vent to his exasperation. He reproached Vance for having made Arneson an unofficial confrère in the investigation, but Vance defended himself on the ground that sooner or later Arneson would supply some piece of seemingly irrelevant information that could be used as an advantageous point de départ. His crimino-mathematical theory is of course rubbish, said Vance. Psychology, not abstract science, will eventually reduce this conundrum to its elements. But we need material to go on, and Arneson knows the inwardness of the Dillard home better than we can ever know it. He knows the Druckers, and he knows Pardee, and it goes without saying that a man who has had the academic honors heaped on him that he has possesses an unusually keen mind. As long as he gives his thought and attention to the case, there's the chance that he'll hit upon something of vital importance to us. You may be right, grumbled Markham, but the man's derisive attitude gets on my nerves. Be more Catholic, urged Vance. Consider his ironies in relation to his scientific speculations. What could be more natural than that a man who projects his mind constantly into the vast interplanetary reaches and deals with light years and infinities and hyperphysical dimensions should sniff derisively at the infinitesimals of this life? Stout fella, Arneson. Not homey and comfortable, perhaps, but dashed interested. Vance himself had taken the case with unwanted seriousness. His Menander translations had been definitely put aside. He became moody and waspish, a sure sign that his mind was busy with an absorbing problem. After dinner each night he went into his library and read for hours, not the classic and aesthetic volumes on which he generally spent his time, but such books as Bernard Hart's The Psychology of Insanity, Freud's Der Witz und seine Beziehung zum Unbewussten, Coryats Abnormal Psychology and Repressed Emotions, Lippos Komik und Humor, Daniel A. Hübsch's The Murder Complex, Janet's Les Obsessions et la Psychasthenie, Donats über Arithmomanie, Ricklins Wish Fulfillment and Fairy Tales, Lepmans Die forensische Bedeutung der Zwangsvorstellungen, Kuno Fischers Über den Witz, Erich Wulffens Kriminalpsychologie, Hollandens The Insanity of Genius, and Gross's Die Spiele des Menschen. He spent hours going over the police reports. He called twice at the Dillards, and on one occasion visited Mrs. Drucker in company with Belle Dillard. He had a long discussion one night with Drucker and Arneson on De Sitter's conception of physical space as a Lobachevskian pseudosphere, his object being, I surmised, to acquaint himself with Drucker's mentality. He read Drucker's book, World Lines in Multidimensional Continua, and spent nearly an entire day studying Janowski's and Tarash's analyses of the Pardee Gambit. On Sunday, 8 days after the murder of Robin, he said to me, Ehovan, this problem is unbelievably subtle. No ordinary investigation will ever probe it. It lies in a strange territory of the brain, and its superficial childishness is its most terrible and baffling aspect. Nor is the perpetrator going to be content with a single coup. Cock Robin's death serves no definitive end. The perverted imagination that concocted this beastly crime is insatiable, and unless we can expose the abnormal psychological mechanism back of it, there will be more grim jokes to contend with. The very next morning, his prognostication was verified. We went to Markham's office at 11 o'clock to hear Heath's report and to discuss further lines of action. Though 9 days had passed since Robin had been found murdered, no progress had been made in the case, and the newspapers had grown bitter in their criticisms of the police and the district attorney's office. It was therefore with considerable depression that Markham greeted us that Monday morning. Heath had not yet arrived, but when he came a few minutes later, it was obvious that he too was discouraged. "We run up against a brick wall, sir, every way we turn," he repined when he had outlined the results of his men's activities. "There ain't a sign of a motive, and outside of Spurling there's nobody on the landscape that we can hang anything on. I'm coming to the conclusion that it was some stick-up man who ambled into the archery room that morning and messed things up." "Stick-up men, Sergeant," countered Vance, "are deuced unimaginative, and they're without a sense of humour, whereas the Johnny who sent Robin on the long, long trail had both imagination and humour. He wasn't content merely to kill Robin. He had to turn the act into an insane joke. Then, lest the public wouldn't see the point, he wrote explanatory letters to the press. Does that sound like the procedure of an itinerant thug?" Heath smoked unhappily for several minutes without speaking, and at length turned a gaze of exasperated dismay upon Markham. "There's no sense in anything that's breaking round this town lately," he complained. "Just this morning a guy named Sprigg was shot in Riverside Park, up near 84th Street. Money in his pocket, nothing taken. Just shot. Young fella, student at Columbia. Lived with his parents. No enemies. Went out to take his usual walk before going to class. Found dead half an hour later by a bricklayer. The sergeant chewed viciously on his cigar. Now we got that homicide to worry about, and we'll probably get hell from the newspapers if we don't clear it up pronto. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing to go on." "Still, Sergeant," said Vance consolingly, "shooting a man is an ordinary event. There are numerous commonplace reasons for that sort of crime. It's the scenic and dramatic appurtenances of Robin's murder that play havoc with all our processes of deduction. If only it wasn't a nursery affair." Suddenly he stopped speaking, and his eyelids drooped slightly. Leaning forward, he very deliberately crushed out his cigarette. "Did you say, Sergeant, that this chap's name was Sprigg?" Heath nodded gloomily. "And I say," despite Vance's effort, there was a note of eagerness in his tone, "what was his first name?" Heath gave Vance a look of puzzled surprise, but after a brief pause he drew forth his battered notebook and riffled the pages. "John Sprigg," he answered. "Johnny Sprigg." Vance took out another cigarette and lighted it with great care. "And tell me, was he shot with a .32? "Huh." Heath's eyes rounded and his chin shot forward. "Yes, a .32. "And was he shot through the top of his head?" The sergeant sprang to his feet and stared at Vance with ludicrous bewilderment. Slowly his head moved up and down. "That's right. But how in hell, sir?" Vance held up a silencing hand. It was, however, the look on his face, rather than his gesture, that cut short the query. "Oh, my precious aunt!" He rose like a man in a daze and gazed fixedly before him. Had I not known him so well, I would have sworn he was frightened. Then, going to the tall window behind Markham's desk, he stood looking down on the grey stone walls of the tombs. "I can't credit it," he murmured. "It's too ghastly. But of course it's so." Markham's impatient voice sounded. "What's all this mumbling about, Vance?" Don't be so damned mysterious. How did you happen to know that Sprigg was shot through the crown with a .32? And what's the point anyway? Vance turned and met Markham's eyes. Don't you see? He asked softly. It's the second act of this devilish parody. Have you forgotten your Mother Goose? And in a hushed voice that brought a sense of unutterable horror into that dingy old office, he recited, There was a little man, and he had a little gun, and his bullets were made of lead. He shot Johnny Sprigg through the middle of his wig and knocked it right off of his head. Chapter 9. The Tensor Formula. Monday, April 11th, 11:30 a.m. Markham sat staring at Vance like a man hypnotized. Heath stood rigid, his mouth partly open, his cigar held a few inches from his lips. There was something almost comic in the sergeant's attitude, and I had a nervous inclination to laugh, but for the moment my blood seemed frozen, and all muscular movement was impossible. Markham was the first to speak. Jerking his head backward, he brought his hand down violently on the desktop. What new lunacy of yours is this? He was fighting desperately against Vance's dumbfounding suggestion. I'm beginning to think the Robin case has affected your mind. Can't a man with the commonplace name of Sprigg be shot without your trying to turn it into some grotesque hocus-pocus? Still, you must admit, Markham, old dear, returned Vance mildly, this particular Johnny Sprigg was shot with a little gun through the middle of his wig, so to speak. What if he was? A dull flush had crept into Markham's face. Is that any reason for your going about babbling Mother Goose rhymes? Oh, I say. I never babble, don't you know? Vance had dropped into a chair facing the district attorney's desk. I may not be a thrilling elocutionist, but really now I don't babble. He gave Heath an ingratiating smile. Do I, Sergeant? But Heath had no opinion to express. He still held his astonished pose, though his eyes had now become mere slits in his broad, pugnacious face. Are you seriously suggesting, began Markham, but Vance interrupted him. Yes, I'm seriously suggesting that the person who killed Cock Robin with an arrow has vented his grim humor upon the hapless Sprigg. Coincidence is out of the question. Such repetitive parallels would knock the entire foundation out from all sanity and reason. Upon my soul, the world is mad enough. But such madness would dissipate all science and rational thinking. Sprigg's death is rather hideous, but it must be faced. And however much you may force yourself to protest against its incredible implications, you'll eventually have to accept them. Markham had risen and was pacing nervously up and down. I'll grant there are inexplicable elements in this new crime. His combativeness had gone, and his tone had moderated. But if we assume, even tentatively, that some maniac is at large reconstructing the rhymes of his nursery days, I can't see how it will help us. It would practically close all routine lines of investigation. I shouldn't say that, don't you know? Vance was smoking meditatively. I'm inclined to think that such an assumption would supply us with a definite basis of inquiry. Sure, snapped Heath with ponderous sarcasm. All we got to do is to go out and find one bug among 6 million people. A cinch. Don't let the fumes of discouragement overcome you, Sergeant. Our elusive jester is a rather distinctive entomological specimen. Moreover, we have certain clues as to his exact habitat. Markham swung round. What do you mean by that? Merely that this second crime is related to the first not only psychologically but geographically. Both murders were committed within a few blocks of each other. Our destructive demon at least has a weakness for the neighborhood in which the Dillard house is situated. Furthermore, the very factors of the two murders preclude the possibility of his having come from afar to give rein to his distorted humor in unfamiliar surroundings. As I learnedly pointed out to you, Robin was translated into the beyond by someone who knew all the conditions obtaining at the Dillard house at the exact hour the grisly drama was performed. And surely it's obvious that this second crime could not have been so tidily staged, had not the impresario been acquainted with Sprigg's ambulatory intentions this morning. Indeed, The entire mechanism of these weird playlets proves that the operator was intimately cognizant of all the circumstances surrounding his victims. The heavy silence that followed was broken by Heath. "If you're right, Mr. Vance, then that lets Sperling out." The sergeant made even this qualified admission reluctantly, but it showed that Vance's argument had not been without its effect on him. He turned desperately to the district attorney. "What do you think we'd better do, sir?" Markham was still battling against the acceptance of Vance's theory, and he did not answer. Presently, however, he reseated himself at his desk and drummed with his fingers upon the blotter. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Who's in charge of the Sprigg case, Sergeant?" "Captain Pitts." The local men at the 68th Street station grabbed it first, but when the news was relayed to the bureau, Pitts and a couple of our boys went up to look into it. "Pitts got back just before I came over here. Says it's a washout, but Inspector Moran 15 told him to stay with it." Markham pressed the buzzer beneath the edge of his desk, and Swacker, his youthful secretary, appeared at the swinging door that led to the clerical room between the district attorney's private office and the main waiting room. "Get Inspector Moran on the wire," he ordered. When the connection had been made, he drew the telephone toward him and spoke for several minutes. When he had replaced the receiver, he gave Heath a weary smile. "You're now officially handling the Sprigg case, Sergeant. Captain Pitts will be here presently, and then we'll know where we stand." He began looking through a pile of papers before him. "I've got to be convinced," he added half-heartedly, "that Sprigg and Robin are tied up in the same sack." Pitts, a short, stocky man with a lean, hard face and a black toothbrush mustache, arrived 10 minutes later. He was, I learned afterwards, one of the most competent men in the detective division. His specialty was white-collar gangsters. He shook hands with Markham and gave Heath a companionable leer. When introduced to Vance and me, he focused suspicious eyes on us and bowed grudgingly. But as he was about to turn away, his expression suddenly changed. "Mr. Philo Vance, is it?" he asked. "Alas!" "So it seems, Captain," Vance sighed. Pitts grinned and, stepping forward, held out his hand. "Glad to meet you, sir. Heard the sergeant speak of you often." "Mr. Vance is helping us unofficially with the Robin case, Captain," explained Markham. "And since this man Sprigg was killed in the same neighborhood, we thought we'd like to hear your preliminary report on the affair." He took out a box of Corona Perfectos and pushed it across the desk. "You needn't put the request that way, sir." The captain smiled and, selecting a cigar, held it to his nose with a kind of voluptuous satisfaction. "The inspector told me you had some ideas about this new case and wanted to take it on. To tell you the truth, I'm glad to get rid of it." He sat down leisurely and lighted his cigar. "What would you like to know, sir?" "Let us have the whole story," said Markham. Pitts settled himself comfortably. "Well, I happened to be on hand when the case came through, a little after 8 this morning, and I took a couple of the boys and beat it uptown. The local men were on the job, and an assistant medical examiner arrived the same time I did." "Did you hear his report, Captain?" asked Vance. "Sure. Sprigg was shot through the top of the head with a .32. No signs of a struggle, no bruises or anything, nothing fancy, just a straight shooting. Was he lying on his back when found?" "That's right, stretched out nice and pretty, right in the middle of the walk." "And wasn't his skull fractured where he'd fallen on the asphalt?" The question was put negligently. Pitts took his cigar from his mouth and gave Vance a sly look. "I guess maybe you fellows over here do know something about this case." He nodded his head sagaciously. "Yes, the back of the guy's skull was all bashed in. He sure had a tough fall, but I guess he didn't feel it, not with that bullet in his brain." "Speaking of the shot, Captain, didn't anything about it strike you as peculiar?" "Well, yes," Pitts admitted, rolling his cigar meditatively between his thumb and forefinger. "The top of a guy's head isn't where I'd ordinarily look for a bullet hole. And his hat wasn't touched. It must have fallen off before he was potted. You might call those facts peculiar, Mr. Vance." "Yes, Captain, they're dashed peculiar." And I take it the pistol was held at close range, not more'n a couple of inches away. The hair was singed round the hole. He made a broad gesture of inconsequence. Still and all, the guy might have seen the other fellow draw the gun and ducked forward, spilling his hat. That would account for his getting the shot at close range in the top of the head. Quite. Except that in that case he wouldn't have fallen over back, but would have pitched forward on his face. But go on with the story, Captain. Pitts gave Vance a look of crafty agreement and continued. The first thing I did was to go through the fellow's pockets. He had a good gold watch on him and about $15 in bills and silver, so it didn't look like a robbery, unless the guy that shot him got panicky and beat it. But that didn't seem likely, for there's never anyone round that part of the park early in the morning, and the walk there dips under a stone bluff, so that the view is cut off. The bird that did the job certainly picked a swell place for it. Anyhow, I left a couple of men to guard the body till the wagon came for it, and went up to Spriggs' house in 93rd Street. I'd got his name and address from a couple of letters in his pocket. I found out he was a student at Columbia, living with his parents, and that it was his habit to take a walk in the park after breakfast. He left home this morning about 7:30. It was his habit to promenade in the park each morning, murmured Vance. Most interesting. Even so, that don't get us anywheres, returned Pitts. Plenty of fellows take an early constitutional. And there was nothing unusual about Sprigg this morning. He wasn't worried about anything, his folks told me, and was cheerful enough when he said goodbye to 'em. After that, I hopped up to the university and made inquiries, talked to a couple of the students that knew him, and also to one of the instructors. Sprigg was a quiet sort of chap, didn't make friends and kept pretty much to himself. Serious bird, always working at his studies, stood high in his classes and was never seen going around with Janes. Didn't like women, in fact. Wasn't what you'd call sociable. From all reports, he was the last man to get in a mess of any kind. That's why I can't see anything special in his getting shot. It must have been an accident of some kind. Might have been taken for somebody else. And he was found at what time? About 7:15. A bricklayer on the new 79th Street dock was cutting across the embankment toward the railway tracks and saw him. He notified one of the post officers on the drive, who phoned in to the local station. And Sprigg left his home in 93rd Street at 7:30. Vance gazed at the ceiling meditatively. Therefore, he would have had just enough time to reach this point in the park before being killed. It looks as if someone who knew his habits was waiting for him. Neatness and dispatch, what? It doesn't appear exactly fortuitous, does it, Markham? Ignoring the jibe, Markham addressed Pitts. Was there nothing found that could possibly be used as a lead? No, sir. My men combed the spot pretty thoroughly, but nothing showed up. And in Sprigg's pockets, among his papers? Question mark. Not a thing. I've got all the stuff at the bureau, a couple of ordinary letters, a few odds and ends of the usual kind. He paused as if suddenly remembering something and pulled out a dog-eared notebook. There was this, he said unenthusiastically, handing a torn, triangular scrap of paper to Markham. It was found under the fellow's body. It don't mean anything, but I stuck it in my pocket, force of habit. The paper was not more than 4 inches long, and appeared to have been torn from the corner of an ordinary sheet of unruled stationery. It contained part of a typewritten mathematical formula, with the lambda, the equals, and the infinity sign marked in with pencil. I reproduce the paper here, for despite its seeming irrelevancy, it was to play a sinister and amazing part in the investigation of Sprigg's death. Vance glanced only casually at the exhibit, but Markham held it in his hand, frowning at it for several moments. He was about to make some comment when he caught Vance's eye, and instead he tossed the paper to the desk carelessly with a slight shrug. Is this everything you found? That's all, sir. Markham rose. We're very grateful to you, Captain. I don't know what we'll be able to make out of this Sprigg case, but we'll look into it. He pointed to the box of perfectos. Put a couple in your pocket before you go. Much obliged, sir. Pitts selected the cigars and, placing them tenderly in his waistcoat pocket, shook hands with all of us. When he had gone, Vance got up with alacrity and bent over the scrap of paper on Markham's desk. My word! He took out his monocle and studied the symbols for several moments. Most alluring. Now, where have I seen that formula recently? Ah, the Riemann-Christoffel tensor, of course. Drucker uses it in his book for determining the Gaussian curvature of spherical and homoloidal space. But what was Sprigg doing with it? The formula is considerably beyond the college curricula. He held the paper up to the light. It's the same stock as that on which the bishop notes are written. And you probably observed that the typing is also similar. Heath had stepped forward and now scrutinized the paper. It's the same, all right? The fact seemed to nonplus him. That's a link anyway between the two crimes. Vance's eyes took on a puzzled look. A link, yes, but the presence of the formula under Sprigg's body appears as irrational as the murder itself. Markham moved uneasily. You say it is a formula that Drucker uses in his book? Yes, but the fact doesn't necessarily involve him. The tensor is known to all advanced mathematicians. It is one of the technical expressions used in non-Euclidean geometry, and though it was discovered by Riemann in connection with a concrete problem in physics, it has now become of widespread importance in the mathematics of relativity. It's highly scientific in the abstract sense and can have no direct bearing on Sprigg's murder. He sat down again. Arneson will be delighted with the find. He may be able to work out some astonishing conclusion from it. I see no reason, protested Markham, to inform Arneson of this new case. My idea would be to keep it under cover as much as possible. The bishop won't let you, I fear, returned Vance. Markham set his jaw. Good God, he burst out. What damnable sort of thing are we facing? I expect every minute to wake up and discover I've been living a nightmare. No such luck, sir, growled Heath. He took a resolute breath like a man preparing for combat. What's on the cards? Where do we go from here? I need action. Markham appealed to Vance. You seem to have some idea about this affair. What's your suggestion? I frankly admit I'm floundering about in a black chaos. Vance inhaled deeply on his cigarette. Then he leaned forward as if to give emphasis to his words. Markham, old man, there's only one conclusion to be drawn. These two murders were engineered by the same brain. Both sprang from the same grotesque impulse. And since the first of them was committed by someone intimately familiar with conditions inside the Dillard house, it follows that we must now look for a person who, in addition to that knowledge, had definite information that a man named John Sprigg was in the habit of taking a walk each morning in a certain part of Riverside Park. Having found such a person, we must check up on the points of time, place, opportunity, and possible motive. There's some interrelation between Sprigg and the Dillards. What it is, I don't know. But our first move should be to find out. What better starting point than the Dillard house itself? We'll get some lunch first, said Markham wearily. Then we'll run out there. Chapter 10. A refusal of aid. Monday, April 11th, 2 p.m. It was shortly after 2 o'clock when we reached the Dillard house. Pine answered our ring, and if our visit caused him any surprise, he succeeded admirably in hiding it. In the look he gave Heath, however, I detected a certain uneasiness. But when he spoke, his voice had the flat, unctuous quality of the well-trained servant. Mr. Arneson has not returned from the university, he informed us. Mind-reading, I see, said Vance, is not your forte, Pine. We called to see you and Professor Dillard. The man looked ill at ease, but before he could answer, Miss Dillard appeared in the archway of the drawing-room. I thought I recognized your voice, Mr. Vance. She included us all in a smile of wistful welcome. Please come in. Lady May dropped in for a few minutes. We're going riding together this afternoon, she explained as we entered the room. Mrs. Drucker stood by the center table, one bony hand on the back of the chair from which she had evidently just risen. There was fear in her eyes as she stared at us unblinkingly, and her lean features seemed almost contorted. She made no effort to speak, but stood rigidly as if waiting for some dread pronouncement, like a convicted prisoner at the bar about to receive sentence. Belle Dillard's pleasant voice relieved the tensity of the situation. "I'll run up and tell Uncle you're here." She had no sooner quitted the room than Mrs. Drucker leaned over the table and said to Markham in a sepulchral, awe-stricken whisper, "I know why you've come. It's about that fine young man who was shot in the park this morning." So amazing and unexpected were her words that Markham could make no immediate answer. And it was Vance who replied, "You have heard of the tragedy, then, Mrs. Drucker. How could the news have come to you so soon?" A look of canniness came into the woman's expression, giving her the appearance of an evil old witch. "Everyone is talking about it in the neighborhood," she answered evasively. "Indeed? That's most unfortunate. But why do you assume we have come here to make inquiries about it? Wasn't the young man's name Johnny Sprigg?" A faint, terrible smile accompanied the question. "So it was. John E. Sprigg. Still, that does not explain his connection with the Dillards." "Ah, but it does." Her head moved up and down with a sort of horrible satisfaction. "It's a game. A child's game. First Cock Robin, then Johnny Sprigg. Children must play. All healthy children must play." Her mood suddenly changed. A softness shone on her face and her eyes grew sad. "It's a rather diabolical game, don't you think, Mrs. Drucker? And why not? Isn't life itself diabolical? For some of us, yes." A curious sympathy informed Vance's words as he gazed at this strange, tragic creature before us. "Tell me," he went on quickly in an altered tone, "do you know who the bishop is?" "The bishop?" She frowned perplexedly. "No, I don't know him. Is that another child's game?" "Something of that kind, I imagine. At any rate, the bishop is interested in Cock Robin and Johnny Sprigg. In fact, he may be the person who is making up these fantastic games. And we're looking for him, Mrs. Drucker. We hope to learn the truth from him." The woman shook her head vaguely. "I don't know him." Then she glared vindictively at Markham. "But it's not going to do you any good to try to find out who killed Cock Robin and shot Johnny Sprigg through the middle of his wig. You'll never learn. Never, never." Her voice had risen excitedly, and a fit of trembling seized her. At this moment, Belle Dillard re-entered the room, and going quickly to Mrs. Drucker, put her arm about her. "Come," she said soothingly. "We'll have a long drive in the country, Lady May." Reproachfully, she turned to Markham and said coldly, "Uncle wishes you to come to the library." With that, she led Mrs. Drucker from the room and down the hall. "Now that's a queer one, sir," commented Heath, who had stood looking on with bewildered amazement. "She had the dope on this Johnny Sprigg stuff all the time." Vance nodded. "And our appearance here frightened her. Still, her mind is morbid and sensitive, Sergeant, and dwelling as she does constantly on her son's deformity in the early days when he was like other children, it's quite possible she merely hit accidentally upon the Mother Goose significance of Robin's and Sprigg's death." I wonder he looked toward Markham. There are strange undercurrents in this case, incredible and terrifying implications. It's like being lost in the Dovre-Troll caverns of Ibsen's Peer Gynt, where only monstrosities and abnormalities exist. He shrugged his shoulders, though I knew he had not wholly escaped the pall of horror cast on us by Mrs. Drucker's words. "Perhaps we can find a little solid footing with Professor Dillard." The professor received us without enthusiasm and with but scant cordiality. His desk was littered with papers, and it was obvious that we had disturbed him in the midst of his labors. "Why this unexpected visit, Markham?" he asked after we had seated ourselves. "Have you something to report on Robin's death?" He marked a page in Wales' Space, Time and Matter, and settling back reluctantly, regarded us with impatience. "I'm very busy working on a problem of Mach's mechanics." "I regret," said Markham. "I have nothing to report on the Robin case. But there has been another murder in this neighborhood today, and we have reason to believe that it may be connected with Robin's death. What I wanted particularly to ask you, sir, is whether or not the name of John E. Sprigg is familiar to you." Professor Dillard's expression of annoyance changed quickly. Is that the name of the man who was killed? There was no longer any lack of interest in his attitude. Yes, a man named John E. Sprigg was shot in Riverside Park, near 84th Street, this morning shortly after 7:30. The professor's eyes wandered to the mantelpiece, and he was silent for several moments. He seemed to be debating inwardly some point that troubled him. Yes, he said at length. We do know a young man of that name, though it's wholly unlikely he's the same one. Who is he? Markham's voice was eagerly insistent. Again the professor hesitated. The lad I have in mind is Arneson's prize student in mathematics, what they'd call at Cambridge a senior wrangler. How do you happen to know him, sir? Arneson has brought him to the house here several times. Wanted me to see him and talk to him. Arneson was quite proud of the boy, and I must admit he showed unusual talent. Then he was known to all the members of the household. Yes. Bell met him, I think, and if by the household you include Pine and Beadle, I should say the name was probably familiar to them too. Vance asked the next question. Did the Druckers know Sprigg, Professor Dillard? It's quite possible. Arneson and Drucker see each other a great deal. Come to think of it, I believe Drucker was here one night when Sprigg called. And Ipardie, did he also know Sprigg? As to that, I couldn't say. The professor tapped impatiently on the arm of his chair and turned back to Markham. See here. His voice held a worried petulance. What's the point of these questions? What has our knowing a student named Sprigg to do with this morning's affair? Surely you don't mean to tell me that the man who was killed was Arneson's pupil? I'm afraid it's true, said Markham. There was a note of anxiety, of fear almost, I thought, in the professor's voice when he next spoke. Even so, what can that fact have to do with us? And how can you possibly connect his death with Robin's? I admit we have nothing definite to go on, Markham told him, but the purposelessness of both crimes, the total lack of any motive in either case, seems to give them a curious unity of aspect. You mean, of course, that you have found no motive, but if all crimes without apparent motive were assumed to be connected, also there are the elements of time and proximity in these two cases, Markham amplified. Is that the basis of your assumption? The professor's manner was benevolently contemptuous. You never were a good mathematician, Markham, but at least you should know that no hypothesis can be built on such a flimsy premise. Both names, interposed Vance, Cock Robin and Johnny Sprigg, are the subjects of well-known nursery rhymes. The old man stared at him with undisguised astonishment, and gradually an angry flush mounted to his face. Your humour, sir, is out of place. It is not my humour, alas, replied Vance sadly. The jest is the bishop's. The bishop? Professor Dillard strove to curb his irritation. Look here, Markham, I won't be played with. That's the second mention of a mysterious bishop that's been made in this room, and I want to know the meaning of it. Even if a crank did write an insane letter to the papers in connection with Robin's death, what has this bishop to do with Sprigg? A paper was found beneath Sprigg's body bearing a mathematical formula typed on the same machine as the bishop notes. What? The professor bent forward. The same machine, you say? And a mathematical formula? What was the formula? Markham opened his pocketbook and held out the triangular scrap of paper that Pitts had given him. The Riemann-Christoffel tensor. Professor Dillard sat for a long time gazing at the paper. Then he handed it back to Markham. He seemed suddenly to have grown older, and there was a weary look in his eyes as he lifted them to us. I don't see any light in this matter. His tone was one of hopeless resignation. But perhaps you are right in following your present course. What do you want of me? Markham was plainly puzzled by the other's altered attitude. I came to you primarily to ascertain if there was any link between Sprigg and this house. But to be quite candid, I don't see how that link, now that I have it, fits into the chain. I would, however, like your permission to question Pine and Beadle in whatever way I think advisable. Ask them anything you like, Markham. You shall never be able to accuse me of having stood in your way." He glanced up appealingly. "But you will, I hope, advise me before you take any drastic steps." "That I can promise you, sir." Markham rose. "But I fear we are a long way from any drastic measures at present." He held out his hand, and from his manner it was evident he had sensed some hidden anxiety in the old man, and wanted to express his sympathy without voicing his feelings. The professor walked with us to the door. "I can't understand that type tensor," he murmured, shaking his head, "but if there's anything I can do—" "There is something you can do for us, Professor Dillard," said Vance, pausing at the door. "On the morning Robin was killed, we interviewed Mrs. Drucker." "Ah." "And though she denied having sat at her window during the forenoon, there is a possibility she saw something happen on the archery range between 11 and 12. "She gave you that impression?" There was an undertone of suppressed interest in the professor's question. "Only in a remote way. It was Drucker's statement that he had heard his mother scream, and her denial of having screamed, that led me to believe that she might have seen something she preferred to keep from us. And it occurred to me that you would probably have more influence with her than anyone else, and that if she did indeed witness anything, you might prevail upon her to speak." "No." Professor Dillard spoke almost harshly, but he immediately placed his hand on Markham's arm, and his tone changed. "There are some things you must not ask me to do for you. If that poor harassed woman saw anything from her window that morning, you must find it out for yourself. I'll have no hand in torturing her, and I sincerely hope you'll not worry her either. There are other ways of finding out what you want to know." He looked straight into Markham's eyes. "She must not be the one to tell you. You yourself would be sorry afterwards." "We must find out what we can," Markham answered resolutely but with kindliness. "There's a fiend loose in this city, and I cannot stay my hand to save anyone from suffering, however tragic that suffering may be. But I assure you I shall not unnecessarily torture anyone." "Have you thought," asked Professor Dillard quietly, "that the truth you seek may be more frightful even than the crimes themselves? That I shall have to risk, but even if I knew it to be a fact, it would not deter me in any degree." "Certainly not. But Markham, I'm much older than you. I had grey hair when you were a lad struggling with your logs and anti-logs, and when one gets old, one learns the true proportions in the universe. The ratios all change. The estimates we once placed on things lose their meaning. That's why the old are more forgiving. They know that no man-made values are of any importance." "But as long as we must live by human values," argued Markham, "it is my duty to uphold them. And I cannot, through any personal sense of sympathy, refuse to take any avenue that may lead to the truth." "You are perhaps right," the professor sighed, "but you must not ask me to help you in this instance. If you learn the truth, be charitable. Be sure your culprit is accountable before you demand that he be sent to the electric chair. There are diseased minds as well as diseased bodies, and often the two go together." When we had returned to the drawing room, Vance lighted a cigarette with more than his usual care. "The professor," he said, "is not at all happy about Sprigg's death, and though he won't admit it, that tensor formula convinced him that Sprigg and Robin belonged to the same equation. But he was convinced dashed easily. Now why? Moreover, he didn't care to admit that Sprigg was known hereabouts. I don't say he has suspicions, but he has fears. Deuced funny, his attitude. He apparently doesn't want to obstruct the legal justice which you uphold with such touching zeal, Markham, but he most decidedly doesn't care to abet your crusade where the Druckers are concerned. I wonder what's back of his consideration for Mrs. Drucker. I shouldn't say offhand that the professor was of a sentimental nature. And what was that platitude about a diseased mind and a diseased body? Sounded like a prospectus for a physical culture class. What? Lackaday. Let's put a few questions to Pine and kin." Markham sat smoking moodily. I had rarely seen him so despondent. "I don't see what we can hope for from them," he commented. "However, Sergeant, get Pine in here." When Heath had stepped out, Vance gave Markham a waggish look. Really, you shouldn't repine. Let Terence console you. Nil tam difficile est, quin querendo investigari possit. And pon my soul, this is a difficult problem. He became suddenly sober. We're dealing with unknown quantities here. We're pitted against some strange, abnormal force that doesn't operate according to the accepted laws of conduct. It's at once subtle, oh no end subtle, and unfamiliar, but at least we know that it emanates from somewhere in the environs of this old house, and we must search in every psychological nook and cranny. Somewhere about us lies the invisible dragon, so don't be shocked at the questions I shall put to Pine. We must look in the most unlikely places. Footsteps were heard approaching the archway, and a moment later Heath entered with the old butler in tow.